Hey guys, how you doing today? Today's video, a little bit different video. All the records that I'm going to show, and there's about, I don't know, 25 or so records, are my wife's favorite musical genre. And it started out probably, I don't know, a few months ago. I bought a copy of Miles Davis, Jack Johnson, and Billy Cobham's Spectrum, and that kind of started a buying spree. And she said, "Lou, buy some more." So I bought some more. So all these records are jazz fusion and jazz records. So 25 albums or so. I won't say a lot about each one, otherwise the video will be too long. But the best way to get started really is with this artist, Miles Davis, Sorcerer. This is a Miles album from the, I think, mid to late 60s with his second quintet, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter. That period of Miles, if I'm completely honest, is I wasn't that crazy about it at first, but I think it's come to be maybe my favorite Miles period, along with his fusion stuff. I mean, Kind of Blue is always an album that I play all the time, but I've really come to love this 60s period of Miles, and so I've accumulated, most of my Miles is on CD. I have a lot of Miles CD albums on CD, but I've accumulated quite a bit now on vinyl. It's probably in the 20 to 30 range, if I'm pretty accurate with that. So Sorcerer, sort of the two pillars of jazz, obviously Miles Davis and John Coltrane. I have a lot of Coltrane on CD as well. Only two records on vinyl. One was a best of on Impulse that I found a few years ago for under $10, and I picked up this one, Coltrane Jazz. This is from 1961 and is, I guess, from the sessions of Giant Steps, and also from My Favorite Things, which are two big Coltrane albums. The other day I was playing, I think it was on YouTube, some Alice Coltrane, and I think Pharoah Sanders might be on that recording of hers, and my wife was listening to that, and she's like, "What's that yelling and screaming?" And I said to her, "Well, it's not yelling and screaming, it's a saxophone." So that tells you what my wife thinks about jazz. The trumpet is my favorite jazz instrument. So Freddie Hubbard, anytime I can pick up any jazz trumpet, I will look to do so. I think this is one of Freddie's early 70s, maybe from 1970, Red Clay. Another protege of Miles, Wayne Shorter, and his mid-60s album Adam's Apple. It also includes Herbie Hancock. The keyboard player in that Miles group, Herbie Hancock. I've had a used copy of Headhunters for a few years now. Sextant, I believe is how you say it. This album actually came before Headhunters and is very much part of that same trilogy with Headhunters. It includes this album, Headhunters, and this album, Thrust. So some excellent 70s Herbie Hancock. The drummer of that quintet, Tony Williams, and his fusion band, Tony Williams Lifetime, which included John McLaughlin from Mahavishnu Orchestra on guitar and Larry Young on keyboards. I've had this on CD for many years as well, and I was happy to finally get a vinyl copy. Another great jazz guitarist of the 1970s, mainly Larry Coryell. and his third solo album, Spaces. I think there's a different cover to this that's out there as well, which is just Larry's face. I really like this cover. And if you can see the lineup on this, John McLaughlin, Billy Cobham from Mahavishnu, Miroslav Vitous, who was the original bass player in Weather Report, and Chick Corea from Return to Forever. And that's the thing about, I think, jazz artists, is they played a lot on each other's albums. So all of these albums are really in some way connected to one another. So Spaces, great supergroup on there. But a Larry Coryell album that I like better than that is this first album by Larry Coryell's 11th House. So that Spaces was from 1970. I believe this one's from 73, 74. This is the 11th House album. The band included Alphonse Mouzon on drums, who was the drummer from Weather Report, the first drummer from Weather Report, and also Randy Brecker on trumpet. And I like this album better than the other Coryell album, mainly because of that trumpet guitar interplay is fantastic on this. I have another 11th House album, Level 1, which is the album that followed this, but this is probably my favorite Larry Coryell related album. Miroslav Vitous was the bass player on that Spaces album. He was the first bass player in the original lineup for Weather Report, but the most famous bass player for Weather Report was Jaco Pastorius, and Jaco played on this album, which was the debut album by Pat Metheny, Bright Size Life, along with Bob Moses on drums, an excellent jazz trio album, just probably in my top 10 jazz records of all time. Weather Report 830. This is a double live Weather Report album, which included their most popular lineup. So you had the mainstays, Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, but you had Jaco appear on this album, which was during Weather Report's most, I guess, commercially successful period anyway. And then the latter day Weather Report album that also included Jaco Pastorius, Night Passage. This one's okay. It's not bad. Got this for cheap. So that, again, going back to that Spaces album from Larry Coryell, he had Chick Corea on there from Return to Forever. So this album is the second Return to Forever album. At this point, it was still falling under the Chick Corea, and there's Chick on the back, Chick Corea and Return to Forever. But certainly this was a group that included some great players, which I'll show more of. So Light as a Feather. Yeah, Light as a Feather. This is a bit more, I don't know, I want to say a little bit of bossa nova on this, and had some vocals from Flora Purim, I think is her name. It's quite different from some later day Return to Forever albums. So definitely different than Romantic Warrior. And continuing with Return to Forever, we have Stanley Clarke and his first solo album, which I actually prefer more than the Return to Forever albums. I think Stanley's solo albums are better. So this album, School Days, I think for me are better albums, and I love the cover on this one. A few guitarists passed through Return to Forever, but I think the one that's probably most famous is Al Di Meola, and this is called Elegant Gypsy, a solo album. I think he released this while he was still in Return to Forever. Again, back to Spaces from Larry Coryell. John McLaughlin was on that album. John McLaughlin's played obviously with Miles Davis before, and the last Mahavishnu album that I need to get is this album, Apocalypse, and this is Mahavishnu Orchestra Mach 2 with Jean-Luc Ponty in the band at this point in time. The drummer from Mahavishnu Orchestra, Billy Cobham. So I mentioned off the top that me getting Billy Cobham finally on vinyl, the Spectrum album, which was his first solo album, kind of started this fusion buying spree. This is the follow-up to Spectrum Crosswinds. Still a great album, not as good as Spectrum. You have notable players on here, John Abercrombie on guitar, and the Brecker brothers are on here. And I think George Duke is on there as well. And then a live album from Billy Cobham, Shabazz. Yeah, it's called Shabazz. And that followed up Crosswinds. John McLaughlin, when he disbanded Mahavishnu Orchestra, formed the fusion band Shakti, which had heavy East Indian influence. I think this particular Shakti album, which is just called Shakti with John McLaughlin, is actually a single disc live album. I've got two others. So you got some tabla and violin on this. Definitely more Eastern influenced than the Mahavishnu stuff. Joni Mitchell made a slew of jazz fusion albums, jazz pop albums in the 70s. That's my favorite Joni Mitchell period, and there's some really noteworthy players on a lot of those albums. Probably my favorite of the studio albums is Hejira, and Jaco Pastorius is on this album. The album that followed Hejira, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. This is a double LP, and Jaco was on this album as well. And then probably the best of those, even though Hejira is my favorite studio album, we have a double live album, Shadows and Light, where she had a jazz supergroup back her up on this album. Pat Metheny on guitar, Jaco Pastorius on bass, Lyle Mays, who's the keyboard player from the Pat Metheny group, and Michael Brecker on saxophone. Fantastic band. There's a great live video document of that concert on YouTube as well. And then just three more to go. Just some assorted, assorted fusion, and also maybe a little bit proggy at this point. We have Brand X, drawing a blank there. Brand X, Unorthodox Behavior. This was the jazzy, proggy band that Phil Collins started in the late 70s while he was still in Genesis. So yeah, this definitely leans a little bit more on the proggy side of things, and there's some vocals, Phil vocals on here, but mainly instrumental, I would say. And then sort of a fusiony prog band as well, UK. This was the band that was formed by John Wetton and Bill Bruford from King Crimson when King Crimson broke up after the Red album. And they each brought in a member to the band. Bill Bruford brought in Alan Holdsworth, amazing fusion guitarist, and John Wetton brought in Eddie Jobson, who was in Roxy Music on keyboards and violin. So this is a fantastic album. Been hoping to get this for quite a while. We have the German band Passport. At this point, it was a project by Klaus Doldinger, and then the album was named Passport, but subsequently the band took on the name Passport, and then future releases came under the moniker Passport. So this is, this is very accessible fusion from the early 70s, and it actually sounds quite a bit like later period Weather Report to me. And then the very last one, debatable whether this is a fusion album or not, but this guy did dabble in fusion in his career and in jazz. Captain Beefheart and his final studio album, Ice Cream for Crow. This is a bit of a tough listen, but it was going for a good price, and this is kind of hard to come by, so I got this album. Okay, guys, there you have it. My wife's favorite musical genre, jazz.